Hey guys, welcome to the Stand Up Review podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Today we're reviewing Eddie Murphy's 1983 special, Delirious. Let's get into it. So starting off with a little bit of background, everyone should know who Eddie Murphy is. If you don't know who he is, then you're probably too young to watch this show anyway. He's a hugely successful comedian and actor, and pretty much anything he turns his hand to. This is his first stand-up special. He has done some since. And I've always kind of put off watching any of his stand-up stuff. This is the first time I've seen any of his stand-up. And it's kind of a mix of, I've always known him as an actor more than a comedian. I mean, a very funny actor and all his films are great, but I've never really known him in that stand-up role, so I've never felt the need to watch it. But I figured, if we're reviewing comedians, we've got to do some of the greats of the past. And Eddie Murphy is an easy place to start with that. In terms of his style, it's very performance-based, as you would expect from Eddie. A lot of observational comedy, and there's a little bit of storytelling, but it tends not to be a major part of his show. But with all that out of the way, let's get into the show itself. The show opens to Eddie receiving a huge standing ovation from the crowd. He takes a bit of time to acknowledge the band who were playing before he came out, but then he gets straight into the first bit, which is about gay people. This is very well performed. I mean, of course it is, it's Eddie Murphy. It's borderline offensive in places, enough that some people might try and cancel him if they saw it, but he saves it very well at the end and he kind of rewords what he's trying to say. He then goes on to talk about diseases, and he makes a couple of great jokes, but he moves on pretty quick from that into talking about fucking. And he has very short setups to some really great jokes. He doesn't spend a lot of time explaining or getting into some background. He just gives a little bit of background so that you get enough of an idea before hitting you with a really good joke. And he's very good at knowing exactly how much to get out of a bit and how much build-up is needed to really get the laugh at the end. He then goes on to the first major bit of the show where he talks about singers, and he jumps around a few different singers, but the way he writes bits is so well done that he can build up to a joke several times within the same bit or within the same part of a bit even. And even after a big punchline, he's able to start again from scratch on the same topic, which is something that a lot of comedians struggle to do or just avoid doing altogether. And one benefit of that within this bit is that even though it goes on for a long time, it doesn't get boring or feel like it's going on too long at any point. Which again, considering the length of the bit, a lot of comedians would struggle to keep your attention and keep you laughing so often throughout it. Afterwards, he completely changes the tone and he talks about ice cream. This bit builds up really well and gets funnier and funnier as it goes on. It starts off quite bland and sort of some obvious jokes in there, but the longer it goes on, and especially towards the end, it's just brilliant. He goes on to talk about his mum, and throughout the whole show, really, he has small performances littered throughout the bits, but he does a great job of making sure the jokes themselves are funny and the performance doesn't overshadow it in any way. And for someone like Eddie Murphy, it would be very easy for him to just rely on the performance aspect of it, but he really only uses it to enhance jokes and make sure the jokes themselves or the story that he's performing is funny in the first place. He then kind of links this into talking about black women more generally, and he has some really good jokes. With a lot of the show, he kind of finds a middle ground between one-liners and longer stories, but he structures the bits well so that it doesn't feel broken up into smaller bits, and it also doesn't feel like it's anything going on for too long. And it pretty much means that he doesn't waste time setting up a story or giving background. He just goes straight into the important details. In the next bit, he talks about farts, and he tells a longer story here, and again, he's really good at building and building up to the end of a bit, and even at times he'll have what seems like the main punchline, but he'll carry on with the rest of the bit because he knows that what's coming is even better, which again, it's really hard to do. If you've got a great punchline that comes in the middle of a bit, having that faith that what comes afterwards is even better can be hard, but Eddie knows that he's brilliant, so it's always worth the wait for the end of the bit. Another thing worth mentioning here is that he does very well not to make it cheap fart gags. When you say a comedian talks about farting, it tends to get a negative reaction, but he does it very well. After that, he kind of stops the show and takes a picture of the crowd. It's a really weird break in the middle of the show, and maybe he could have got away with it at the start of the show as kind of an introductory thing. He does include some jokes in it, but it just feels a bit awkward and it's not worth the break in the show to do it. But anyway, after that, he talks about his family, and he has a few different stories. This is quite heavily performance based, more so than the rest of the show. But it's still funny, and he's not performing to cover over bad jokes. He's using it to enhance the different stories he's telling. One of the stories goes on longer than it needs to, and he drags it out too much. But for the most part, he's very good at using a joke to break up a bit just before it starts to drag, and he does that in the majority of this bit. He then kind of jumps around a few different topics. They're all really good, and they're clearly just bits that he had some great material on, but just not enough to get a prolonged bit out of it. And I've said it before, but it's so much better to just accept when you've only got a couple of good jokes on a topic rather than trying to drag it out and just putting some average or bad jokes in there. And Eddie realises this and does it really well here. He also has a little section where he talks to a couple of kids in the audience, and he says he'll tell them a joke, so a lot of the show isn't really for kids, so he'll tell them a joke that they can tell at school, and it's actually a really good joke, which is hard considering he kind of builds it up a little bit that he's going to tell this joke. And it's not really a kid-friendly joke, which helps kind of with a little bit of shock factor, but it's a good joke. This then pretty much leads to the end of the show, and he talks a bit about race and how good it is to be a black man performing on stage. Now, this is a different time, 1983, the early 80s. So it's extremely pivotal for black people to see the success of Eddie Murphy. He mentions some historical figures who weren't given the privileges he was. And with that in mind, it's not funny. It's not a funny way to end the show, but it's a very good kind of note to end on. And it would be wrong to mark the show down for ending like that. And there's definitely a way a modern comedian could do that, but especially with the historic context, it's a very, I don't want to say nice, but a very kind of important way to end the show. A few extra things to mention regarding the show. Eddie doesn't really use callbacks. There are one or two little ones. They're used to good effect in places that make sense, but he doesn't rely on them or anything. In terms of transitions, there's a real mix. Certain bits blend together perfectly, and you can't really tell that he's moved on to a new bit until partway through it. But there are also times where he'll just stop and change topic, and I've said it before, but if you can have a seamless transition, then that's the best way to do it. But the second best, or maybe the third, but we'll get to the second when we review someone who does it. But sometimes it is just best to stop and move on rather than try and force something. Eddie doesn't really have a stage persona, he's just Eddie Murphy, and at a certain level of fame, you either become the persona that made you famous, or you can just be yourself in everything you do. And Eddie is at that point, even at this stage of his career, back in 1983. And it works because he's funny and he's light-hearted anyway, so he doesn't really need any kind of stage persona. His natural personality lends itself to comedy brilliantly. As for the audience, there are quite a few overreactions, but this is kind of the start of Eddie Murphy's prime, which is prime probably lasted about 20 years, but this is towards the start of that. So people were just obsessed with everything he did. It's also a big arena, which means the audience noise travels and lasts a lot longer. It can be a little bit off-putting at times, but they're mostly laughing at parts that deserve it. It's just slightly longer than it needs to be. But again, that's to be expected with such a huge name and in an arena like that. Now, some overall thoughts on the show. Eddie's got such great range. He can tell so many different kinds of jokes in so many different styles, and it's always amazing. I was a little bit reluctant to review an Eddie Murphy stand-up because I've only ever known him as an actor, but I'm so glad I did. He's a brilliant comedian, and I fully understand why the likes of Dave Chappelle quote him as an influence. Having now seen this, I completely get how Eddie has become such a huge household name across at least 3 generations now, in a span of over 30, maybe even 40 years. In terms of a rating, there's not really anything wrong with the show, so I'm going to go over 9 out of 10. 100% go and give this a watch. It's brilliant. This podcast is brought to you by our patrons. If you want to help support the podcast, then head on over to patreon.com/standupreview. With tiers starting at as little as £1, there are some great benefits, such as voting for which specials you want reviewed, Q&As, bloopers, early access to podcasts, exclusive podcasts, and many more. Sign up at patreon.com/standupreview, and thank you for your support. As a special limited time offer, anyone who becomes a patron during the month of July, regardless of which tier, can choose one stand-up special that will be reviewed on the podcast, as well as receiving the standard benefits for the tier you choose. This offer runs out on the 31st of July, so head on over to patreon.com/standupreview for this one-time deal. Thanks for listening to the Stand Up Review podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, be sure to subscribe to get new episodes as soon as they come out every Monday, Wednesday and Friday. Check out our Patreon for some awesome benefits at patreon.com/standupreview. If you have any thoughts or suggestions for the show, whether it be a new segment or a show you'd like us to review, let us know on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter @standupreview and give us a follow while you're over there. Feel free to share this or any of our other podcasts on any social media platform. Have a great day and we'll see you for the next episode. This podcast is made possible by our patron, Brad Oldfield. If you would also like to support the podcast, head on over to patreon.com/standupreview and thank you for your support.